At 5:12 on a September morning, Cal Hartley watched a mother bobcat walk into his hay barn, carrying a cub by the scruff. The wild cat did not rush. She crossed the open doorway in 3 measured steps, ribs showing beneath her tawny coat, and stopped beside an old apple crate where Mabel, Cal's calico farm cat, was nursing 3 kittens. Mabel stood immediately. The bobcat lowered the cub onto the straw. For one breathless second, the 2 mothers faced each other across 6 feet of barn floor. Then the bobcat backed away. Cal stayed behind the half-open tack room door, one hand frozen on the latch. He had spent 37 years raising goats and hay on Cedar Hollow Farm in the Missouri Ozarks. He knew enough about bobcats to understand that a mother with a young cub should not be inside a working barn near a domestic cat while a human watched. He also knew better than to step between them. The cub made a thin, rasping cry. Mabel hissed. Her back rose and she positioned herself over her own kittens. The bobcat stopped at the doorway but did not turn around. Her left ear had a split near the tip, and something about her stance bothered Cal. She held her front feet wide apart as if balancing required thought. The cub crawled toward the apple crate. Mabel swatted once at the straw in front of it without making contact. The cub stopped, trembling. The bobcat gave a short, rough call from the doorway. Mabel looked toward her. Then the farm cat lowered herself again. The bobcat cub crawled into the crate. It disappeared between 2 orange kittens and pressed against Mabel's belly. Cal almost stepped forward when he realized what was happening, but training acquired through decades around frightened livestock stopped him. Wild animals did not need a man turning astonishment into interference. The bobcat remained at the threshold for nearly a minute. Then she walked into the gray morning and vanished behind the feed shed. If you saw a wild mother leave her baby beside an animal you trusted, would you intervene immediately or wait long enough to understand what she was trying to escape? Cal waited exactly 2 minutes. Then he closed the barn's interior gate so the farm dogs could not enter and called Dr. Nina Salazar. Nina ran a licensed wildlife rehabilitation center 30 miles north and had helped the county with injured bobcats before. She interrupted Cal twice while he described what he had seen. "Do not touch the cub. I haven't. Do not try to catch the mother. I know. And keep Mabel separated from other animals until I get there. We don't know what either cat may be carrying." Cal looked through the tack room window. Mabel was washing one of her kittens. The bobcat cub lay against her foreleg, smaller than Cal had first thought. Its spotted coat was still soft and woolly, and its ears had only begun to look too large for its head. "Is she nursing it?" Nina asked. Cal watched the cub push beneath Mabel's hind leg. "Looks that way." Nina went quiet. "That can happen with nursing queens," she said. "Maternal behavior can extend to unfamiliar young, especially if the size and cries are similar. But this is not a safe long-term arrangement. Keep the room quiet. I'm on my way." Cal called his daughter next. Erin Hartley taught agricultural science at the county high school and lived 12 miles away. She answered before the second ring. "What happened? How do you know something happened? You don't call before 6 unless an animal is loose or a tractor is on fire." He told her. She said, "I'm coming. You have school. I have a substitute list." Cal started to object, then looked at the barn again. "Bring the trail camera cards from my desk." By sunrise, the mother bobcat had not returned. Cal walked the outside perimeter only after Nina arrived and told him where he could safely step. They kept more than 100 feet from the barn entrance and used binoculars to check the tree line. No bobcat. Nina entered the tack room wearing gloves and carrying a covered transfer crate, but she did not separate the animals immediately. Removing the cub while it was warm, calm, and nursing could create more stress before she knew whether the mother was still nearby. Instead, she placed the camera above the apple crate and examined the cub visually. "About 5 weeks," she said. "Maybe a little older. Thin. Can Mabel feed 4? For a short period, possibly. That isn't the main question." Cal knew what was. Why had a healthy wild mother left a dependent cub at all? Erin arrived with the memory cards and a paper bag of breakfast sandwiches no one touched. They reviewed the cameras in Cal's farm office. At 1:47 a.m., the North Pasture camera showed the bobcat carrying the cub downhill from the limestone ridge. At 2:19, she crossed behind the equipment shed. At 3:06, she appeared outside the hay barn without the cub, then disappeared toward the creek. At 4:38, she returned carrying it again. "She tried somewhere else first," Erin said. Cal replayed the clips. On the final recording, the bobcat stopped beside the blue feed shed. She lowered the cub, disappeared behind the wall for 20 seconds, then returned and lifted it again. Nina enlarged the image. A dead field mouse lay beside the concrete foundation. Its body showed no obvious injury. Cal felt Aaron looking at him. 3 weeks earlier, after rats chewed through $2,000 worth of stored grain bags, Cal had hired a pest control company. Blue locking bait stations now surrounded the feed shed, machine shop, and kidding barn. He had insisted on more stations after the first week. "That mouse could have died from anything," he said. "It could have," Nina replied. On the screen, the bobcat bent toward the mouse. The next frame showed it in her mouth. Cal's office seemed to become very small. Nina advanced the footage. The mother bobcat took 3 steps, dropped the mouse, and stood with her head low. She did not pick it up again. At 4:44 a.m., she carried her cub toward Mabel's barn. Aaron opened the exterior camera from 6 minutes later. The bobcat emerged alone. She crossed the yard, reached the first blue bait station, and collapsed onto her chest beside it. Nina did not let Cal cross the yard. The bobcat lay beside the blue bait station with her head raised barely an inch above the gravel. Her split left ear moved when a truck passed on the county road, but the rest of her body stayed still. "Alive," Nina said through binoculars. "Weak enough that alive is not the same as safe." She called the state conservation officer on duty, then opened her wildlife van. Inside were transport crates, clear shields, a catch pole, heavy gloves, and a veterinary kit. Cal started toward the barn. "Where are you going?" "To get a blanket." "No, stay behind the tractor until I tell you otherwise." He almost argued. Then he looked at the animal he might already have harmed and stopped. Nina approached from the side with a clear shield. The bobcat lifted her head and showed her teeth, but she did not rise. That worried Nina more than a charge would have. Because the cat was already compromised, Nina did not want full immobilization unless necessary. After the conservation officer arrived and blocked the lane, Nina used a pole syringe to give a minimal sedative dose for safe transport. They waited behind barriers. Only after the animal stopped responding strongly to movement did Nina and the officer guide her onto a rigid board and slide her into a covered crate. Cal saw the pale color inside her mouth before the door closed. "What does that mean?" "Could mean anemia, could mean poor circulation." Nina locked the crate. "Right now, it means we move." She took the bobcat into the clean section of Cal's kidding barn, far from Mabel and the cub, and performed the first examination through protected access. The female was dehydrated. Her breathing was shallow but regular. Small bruised areas showed beneath the thin fur of her belly. Nina drew blood. When she pressed gauze to the needle site, it took longer than she liked for the spot to stop seeping. Cal noticed her expression. "Poison?" "Anticoagulant exposure is high on my list. That is not a diagnosis yet." The pest control company answered on Cal's third call. The technician confirmed that every blue station on Cedar Hollow contained anticoagulant rodent bait. The stations were locked and legally placed. No bait appeared scattered outside them. "That means she couldn't get into them," Cal said. "She may not have needed to." "If a rodent ate bait and she ate the rodent, exposure is possible." Cal looked toward the feed shed. For years, he had considered bobcats on the ridge, competitors for rabbits and quail. He had never thought of one eating the mice he wanted gone. The conservation officer photographed each station. Cal walked with him. They found 3 dead mice within 50 yards of the feed shed and a 4th beneath the machine shop floor. None showed an obvious injury. The officer bagged them for testing. The service sticker on the nearest station showed it had been refilled 5 days earlier. After Cal complained that rodents were still chewing feed sacks, he remembered the call. The technician had suggested sealing gaps beneath the granary and cleaning spilled grain before increasing bait. Cal had said harvest was coming. Labor was short, and he needed the problem handled now. He had asked for more stations. Back in the hay barn, Mabel had accepted the wild cub completely enough to create a different problem. The cub was nursing. Mabel's 3 kittens slept against its spotted sides. When Nina entered the tack room, Mabel watched her closely, but did not leave the crate. "We have to separate them soon," Nina said. "Disease risk goes both directions, and a domestic queen is not a substitute for rehabilitation." Cal crouched several feet away. "But she's keeping it alive." "For the moment, yes." Nina weighed the cub in a shallow box while Mabel remained within sight. The young bobcat protested with a harsh rasp and tried to crawl back toward the apple crate. It was underweight. Its gums were a healthy color, unlike its mother's. but Nina collected a small sample for testing. When she returned the cub, Mabel immediately began washing its head. Aaron sat beside Cal on an overturned feed bucket. "You knew the poison could affect wildlife?" "I knew anything could get poisoned if it ate bait." "That isn't what I asked." Cal stared at the blue station visible through the barn door. "The company said the boxes kept other animals out." Aaron's voice stayed quiet. "The boxes keep animals from eating the blocks. They don't keep a mouse from leaving." He knew she was right before she finished. At 9:30, Nina's portable clotting test gave the result she had feared. The mother's blood was taking far too long to clot normally. She started treatment for suspected anticoagulant poisoning while arranging transfer to her rehabilitation clinic for imaging and laboratory work. "She can recover?" Cal asked. "She has a chance." "And the cub?" "If she stabilizes, reunion is still the goal, but not today." The mother was loaded into Nina's van. The cub went into a separate warmed carrier only after Mabel finished nursing. Mabel remained with her own 3 kittens. As Nina prepared to leave, Aaron brought the trail camera laptop outside. "I found something from last week." The footage came from above the hay barn door. 3 nights before Cal requested more bait stations, the Bobcat had crossed the yard carrying a mouse. Instead of leaving, she stopped outside the barn and looked through the open lower door. Inside, Mabel carried 1 kitten into the apple crate. The Bobcat remained there for almost 4 minutes. Another clip from 2 nights later showed her at the same doorway again. She had known the barn held a nursing cat before she became sick. Then, Aaron opened a camera from the limestone ridge. The timestamp was shortly after midnight, before the Bobcat carried her cub down to the farm. The female staggered away from a shallow den beneath a cedar root, returned, and tried to nurse the cub. The cub pushed against her belly for nearly a minute. Nothing happened. Nina looked at Cal. The mother had not simply abandoned her young. By the time she carried the cub to Mabel, she may already have been unable to feed it. The first thing Cal did after Nina's van left was call the pest control company back. This time, he did not ask for another treatment. "I want every bait station picked up today," he said. The technician, Aaron Pike, arrived before noon with mud on his boots and a clipboard beneath one arm. He did not argue. "I recommended exclusion work first," Aaron said as they walked toward the feed shed. Metal flashing under the doors, lidded bins, clean grain around the auger. Bait was faster, but it wasn't the only option. Cal heard accusation even though Aaron did not deliver one. "I know." Aaron stopped beside the nearest blue box. "The stations were locked. If wildlife was exposed, it was probably through rodents after they fed." Cal looked toward the ridge where the Bobcat had carried her cub through darkness. "Pick them up." Every station was photographed before removal. The conservation officer collected dead rodents from around the buildings and marked each location on a farm map. Aaron helped without speaking much. By early afternoon, 9 carcasses had been found in places Cal walked every day without noticing. 2 were inside the hay barn. That changed the question around Mabel. Nina had told them to keep the farm cat and her kittens confined. Aaron moved the apple crate into a large dog kennel without touching the cats directly, and a local veterinarian came to Cedar Hollow to draw blood. Mabel objected loudly. "She's offended, which I prefer to sick," Aaron said. The veterinarian found no obvious signs of poisoning. Mabel's gums were pink, her breathing normal, and her clotting test fell within the expected range. Her 3 kittens looked healthy. The reassurance lasted until Nina called. The Bobcat mother had reached the rehabilitation clinic alive. Imaging showed no major internal injury, but her clotting values were dangerously abnormal. Nina had started vitamin K treatment, fluids, and supportive care. The female remained weak and had produced almost no milk during examination. "The cub's first test is abnormal too," Nina said. Cal tightened his grip on the phone. "How abnormal?" "Not like the mother, but enough that I'm treating the cub while we wait for the laboratory panel." "How would it get poisoned if it was still nursing?" "It may have eaten contaminated prey. At 5 or 6 weeks, a bobcat cub can begin sampling meat the mother brings back. We need evidence before choosing one explanation." Cal looked at the dead mice in evidence bags. For the first time, he pictured the bait moving. A mouse ate from a locked box. The mouse left. A predator found it. The poison crossed the boundary Cal had believed the plastic station created. By mid-afternoon, the conservation officer cleared a careful inspection of the den site. The mother and cub were both in professional care, so there was no reason to approach closely, but the area could hold evidence. Cal stayed back while the officer worked beneath the cedar root. The den was a dry pocket between limestone and soil. There was no second cub. The bedding held rabbit fur, leaves, and the remains of several small prey animals. 3 were rodents. One still had bright blue-green material in its stomach. Aaron turned away from the evidence tray. Cal did not. "I brought it here," he said. "You brought bait to the farm," Aaron replied. "You didn't carry that mouse to the den." "That distinction doesn't help much." "It should help enough to make the next decision better." He looked at her. She had his square jaw, and her mother's habit of becoming quieter when angry. 6 months earlier, Aaron had drawn him a rodent control plan: seal the floor gaps, replace broken grain lids, add snap traps inside protected boxes, move spilled feed nightly, install an owl box near the south pasture. Not as a cure, but as one more piece of control. Cal had read 2 pages and left the folder on his desk. The repairs cost money. Harvest was late. His hired hand had quit. Mostly, though, he had been irritated that Aaron kept giving advice without agreeing to return and help run the farm. "You were right about the feed shed," he said. "I didn't need to be right." "No, that's the part you never understand, Dad. When I warn you, I'm not trying to win the farm from you." He had no defense that did not sound childish. The officer called them over after finishing the den survey. A game trail ran from the Cedar Ridge toward Cedar Hollow. Trail camera records showed the Bobcat had used it for weeks. Aaron loaded older footage from a camera Cal had forgotten near the goat lane. The mother appeared 8 nights before the poisoning, carrying a vole. She stopped outside the hay barn. Mabel's kittens were crying inside. The Bobcat remained in the shadow of the doorway for nearly 3 minutes, then left. 2 nights later, she returned. The next clip showed Mabel crossing the yard with 1 kitten in her mouth. The Bobcat watched from behind a wagon wheel and retreated when Cal switched on the porch light. "She knew there was another nursing mother here," Aaron said. "Familiar with her presence," the officer corrected. "We can't say she understood Mabel would adopt a cub." But the pattern mattered. The barn had not been random. The mother had inspected it repeatedly while healthy enough to hunt. Then Aaron found footage from the missing 40 minutes between 3:06 and 4:38 on the final night. At 3:11, the Bobcat entered the barn and left the cub beside the apple crate. At 3:19, Cal's border collie Finn pushed open a loose gate and entered the outer aisle. Mabel carried her kittens deeper into the tack room. The mother Bobcat returned almost immediately. She rushed Finn from the doorway without making contact, retrieved her cub, and carried it away. Cal remembered hearing Finn bark and shutting him in the mudroom without checking why. More than an hour later, after the barn was quiet, the mother brought the cub back a second time. She had tried once, judged the place unsafe, and still returned when her condition worsened. Cal sat down on the office chair. Nina called again before anyone spoke. The laboratory panel on the cub was complete. The exposure was real. Based on the cub's clotting values, Nina believed the mother had probably been feeding it contaminated prey for several days before she lost the strength to hunt. The mother Bobcat survived the night. Nina called Cedar Hollow just after sunrise. Cal answered from the feed shed, where he and Aaron were pulling spilled grain from beneath an auger with a shop vacuum. "She's stronger," Nina said. "Still critical, but stronger." Cal stopped working. "And the cub?" "Stable. The clotting values are improving in both." He leaned against the wall. "What happens now?" "We keep treating them separately until I'm confident neither one has an infectious problem we could worsen by reunion. Then, if the mother is producing milk again and behaving normally, we test whether she'll take the cub back." Cal glanced through the open door toward the hay barn. Mabel sat inside the temporary kennel with her 3 kittens. Her veterinary tests remained normal. She had spent the night pacing whenever she heard movement near the apple crate, as though searching for the 4th body that had slept there. "She kept that cub warm long enough for us to find it," Cal said. "She did." "You think the Bobcat knew that would happen?" "I think she knew a nursing cat was there." "Anything beyond that is interpretation." It was not the answer Cal wanted. He was beginning to understand that wanting certainty had gotten him into trouble before. At the rehabilitation center, Nina changed the mother's treatment routine so almost everything could be done through protected barriers. The Bobcat occupied 2 connected enclosures with a sliding shift door between them. Food, water, and medication could be provided in one side while staff remained behind solid panels. The first morning, the female refused to move when the shift door opened. She flattened herself against the rear wall and watched Nina through the inspection window. Nina waited. She did not prod her forward or increase noise. She closed the outer treatment room, dimmed the lights, and left the shift compartment empty except for water and a covered resting box. 23 minutes later, the Bobcat walked through on her own. Nina closed the divider remotely. For the first time, the veterinary team could clean the main enclosure without sedating her. "That is the kind of trust I like," Nina told Aaron by phone. "Not trust in us as friends. Trust in a predictable routine." The cub occupied a separate room farther down the building. Human contact was kept brief. It accepted formula from a species-appropriate feeding setup and began eating tiny portions of prepared meat under supervision. On the third day, both animals' disease screening came back clear. Nina moved the cub into an adjoining enclosure separated from its mother by 2 layers of secure mesh and a narrow service space. The mother heard it before she saw it. She rose from her resting box and approached the divider with her body low. The cub gave the same rasping cry Cal had heard in the barn. The mother stopped, then she answered with a short call and remained beside the barrier. The cub pressed toward her. Nina watched from a camera in another room. No one entered. For 40 minutes, the female stayed within several feet of the partition. Her behavior did not prove she would accept the cub once they shared space again, but it was the strongest sign Nina had seen that the maternal bond remained intact. At Cedar Hollow, Cal spent those same days rebuilding the way the farm handled rodents. Aaron removed the last bait station. Aaron brought out the control plan Cal had ignored 6 months earlier, its pages still bent where he had shoved them into a desk drawer. They started with the grain. Broken lids were replaced. Steel flashing covered gaps beneath the feed room doors. Snap traps went inside, enclosed boxes where goats, cats, and wildlife could not reach them. Cal moved sacks from the floor onto raised pallets and assigned himself the nightly job of sweeping spilled grain. Aaron watched him screw a metal plate across a hole beside the machine shop. "You know," she said, "you could have done this when I suggested it." "I'm aware. I just wanted to hear you say it." He looked over his shoulder. She smiled slightly. He almost smiled back, then returned to the drill. Later, while they ate lunch on the tailgate, Cal said, "I thought you were trying to redesign everything because you didn't trust me to run the place." Aaron folded her sandwich wrapper. "I was trying to help because I knew you were running it alone." That sounded the same to me. That's the problem. Cal looked across the south pasture. He had wanted Aaron to come back to Cedar Hollow after college. When she chose teaching instead, every suggestion she offered from outside the farm felt like proof she believed he had fallen behind. So he rejected ideas he might otherwise have considered. "I made your advice into an argument you weren't having," he said. Aaron nodded. "Pretty much." It was not a complete repair between them, but it was the first conversation in years that did not end with one of them changing the subject. That afternoon, Conservation Officer Malik Dunn returned with laboratory results from the dead rodents. 6 of the 9 tested positive for the same anticoagulant compound used in Cal's bait stations. 3 had been found more than 200 yards from any box. "The rodents carried it farther than the plastic station suggested," Malik said. Cal unfolded the property map. "Then once I remove the bait, this ends." Malik did not answer immediately. He placed 3 additional marks beyond Cedar Hollow's fence. "These came from the Miller poultry sheds yesterday. Same compound." Another mark appeared near the grain elevator east of the county road. "And this one came from there." Cal stared at the cluster. A bobcat's hunting range did not stop at his property line. Neither did poisoned prey. If Nina eventually released the mother and cub near the ridge, they could return to the same risk before the medicine was finished. Cal looked at Aaron. Removing his own bait had been easy compared with what came next. He would have to convince neighbors, farmers, and businesses already fighting rodents to change methods because of an animal most of them would never see. Then Malik unfolded one final photograph. It came from a trail camera 2 weeks before the mother entered Cal's barn. The split-eared bobcat crossed the limestone ridge at dusk. 1 cub followed her. Then a second small spotted body stepped into the frame, and behind it came a third. The photograph of 3 cubs changed the search before breakfast. Malik spread every camera location across Cal's kitchen table while Aaron sorted the memory cards by date. Nina joined them by video from the rehabilitation clinic. "Bobcat mothers move young between den sites," Nina said. 3 cubs 2 weeks ago does not mean 3 cubs should still be under that cedar root today." "Could she have moved the others before she got sick?" Cal asked. "Absolutely. What we need is the last confirmed location for each one." At 8:17, Aaron found it. A camera near the north property fence showed the split-eared female carrying a cub toward Miller's poultry farm 4 nights earlier. 43 minutes later, she returned along the same trail alone. The next night, another clip showed her carrying a second cub in the same direction. The third remained with her. That explains why there was only one at the cedar den, Malik said. She had already moved two. Cal looked through the kitchen window toward the limestone ridge. To where? The answer came from Walt Miller. His poultry farm bordered Cedar Hollow, along a half-mile stretch of timber and rock. Walt was 62, practical and already irritated by the conservation truck in his driveway. "I've got chicks coming Monday and rats getting into feed now," he said. "I'm not turning this place into a wildlife preserve." "No one asked you to," Malik replied. "We need to check one likely den site." Walt folded his arms. "Where?" Cal pointed toward an abandoned stone milk house below the oldest chicken shed. Walt's expression changed. The building had not held milk in 40 years. Its rear half was built into the hill, and an old drainage pipe connected it to a limestone seam running toward Cedar Hollow. "I've seen cats around there," Walt admitted. "Thought they were feral." Malik established a buffer and used a pole camera rather than sending anyone inside. The first chamber was empty. The second was not. Two bobcat cubs huddled behind a broken wooden shelf. One backed away immediately when the camera appeared. The other remained crouched beside the wall, head low. There were prey remains around them. 3 mice lay near the entrance. Walt stared at the monitor. "My bait boxes are on the other side of that shed." No one answered. Nina studied the live feed from the clinic. "The active cub looks reasonably responsive. The second concerns me. If the mother is hospitalized and they're only around 5 weeks, they need to come in. Normally, taking healthy bobcat young from a den would have been the wrong decision. Their mother might return. This mother could not. She was 30 miles away receiving treatment for anticoagulant poisoning. Malik approved the rescue. A second rehabilitator arrived with covered transfer crates, barriers, and thick gloves. The milkhouse entrance was narrow enough to control safely, but no one reached blindly toward the animals. They blocked the deeper drainage opening first. The more active cub rushed behind a stone ledge and hissed. The weaker one barely moved. Using a rigid panel, the rehabilitator reduced the available space without touching either cub. A padded net guided the stronger animal into a transfer crate. It struck the crate door once, then disappeared beneath the cover. The second cub required less effort than anyone wanted. It tried to climb the stone ledge, slipped, and sat down. Cal turned away. His phone rang. "Nina." He answered before the first ring finished. "We have a problem with the mother," she said. The female's packed cell volume had dropped sharply despite treatment. Nina suspected internal bleeding related to the anticoagulant exposure. The bobcat needed plasma support and more intensive monitoring at the veterinary hospital connected to the rehabilitation center. "Is she going to make it?" "I don't know." Cal looked at the milk house. The rehabilitator lifted the weak cub into the second crate. 4 nights earlier, the mother had carried 2 young animals to this place one at a time. Then she had gone back for the third, while poison interfered with her blood and her ability to produce milk. Cal tried to imagine the distance from the cedar den to Miller's farm, with a cub in her jaws. Then imagined doing it twice. "Do what you have to do," he said. "We are." The mother was transferred under sedation, administered by the veterinary team. She received plasma, vitamin K, fluids, and oxygen while imaging, searched for serious bleeding. At Miller's farm, Malik collected every rodent carcass around the milk house. Walt called his pest control company before anyone asked. "Pick the anticoagulant boxes up," he said. "All of them." His voice tightened afterward. "I lose feed every week to rats." Aaron stood beside him. "We can help you build an exclusion plan." "You volunteering your father?" Cal expected the old irritation to rise. Instead, he said, "Both of us." Walt looked at him for a long moment. "All right." The 2 rescued cubs reached Nina's clinic shortly after noon. They were placed separately from the first cub until screening and treatment decisions could be made. The stronger one weighed slightly more than its sibling at Cedar Hollow. The weak cub was dehydrated and mildly anemic. Nina began clotting tests immediately. Cal spent the afternoon removing spilled grain from Walt's feed room with Aaron while they waited for results. It was work he could understand. Shovel, sweep, seal the gap, replace the lid. At 5:26, Nina called. The 2 cubs from the milk house had both been exposed. One showed mild clotting changes. The weaker cub showed more. Neither result matched the cub the mother had carried into Cal's hay barn. That cub's exposure had been significantly worse. Aaron lowered the drill. Cal said nothing. Nina continued carefully. We cannot know what the mother understood. We should not turn her behavior into a human decision. I know, but the sequence matters. The mother had moved 2 cubs to the secondary den, while she could still travel. She had returned for the third. The third was the most heavily poisoned cub. It was also the one she had carried past the safe den, across Cal's yard, and twice into the barn where another mother was producing milk. Cal looked toward Cedar Hollow in the fading light. For the first time, the question was no longer why the bobcat had left 1 cub behind. It was why she had carried the sickest one somewhere different from the others. The mother bobcat's first reunion with all 3 cubs happened through wire. Nina waited until the female could stand steadily, eat on her own, and move between treatment compartments without hesitation. Then she placed the cubs in the adjoining enclosure and opened the visual panel. The mother approached within seconds. She paced once along the barrier, smelled each cub through the gap beneath it, and gave a short contact call. The cubs crowded toward her, rasping and pushing over one another. Cal and Aaron watched from a monitor in Nina's office. Neither was allowed inside the animal wing. The split-eared female settled beside the divider. The sickest cub lay on the other side with its paws beneath its chest. Cal recognized it immediately. It was the one that had crawled into Mabel's apple crate. Does she know which one it is? He asked. We can't know that, Nina said, but she's responding normally to all 3. That gives us a path toward reunion. Then Malik arrived with the toxicology report. The concentrations in the rodents formed a pattern. Mice collected near Miller's poultry sheds contained anticoagulant residue. So did the carcass from the grain elevator. But the highest concentrations came from Cedar Hollow, especially the feed shed where Cal had increased bait service. The prey remains from the original cedar den matched the same compound. 1 partially eaten mouse contained enough residue that Nina simply handed the page to Cal. So she was hunting my rat problem. Among other things, Malik said, your grain drew rodents. The bait did not remove them immediately. For a predator, that can create an attractive food source with a hidden risk. Cal folded the report. He had believed the blue boxes contained the danger because the poison stayed inside plastic. Instead, the living part of the system had carried it out for him. Aaron opened the older trail camera archive when they returned to Cedar Hollow. A forgotten camera at the South Grain Lane provided the missing sequence. At 9:40 one night, the bobcat crossed behind the feed shed with a mouse in her mouth. 20 minutes later, the Cedar Ridge camera showed her entering the den. The next evening, the same thing happened. On the 3rd night, she carried another rodent from near the baited shed toward the limestone ridge. The food Cal had protected with poison had attracted prey. The prey had attracted the bobcat. The mother had carried that prey to the same cubs the poison later threatened. Another camera changed the meaning of the final night. It stood on Miller's fence line, aimed accidentally toward the abandoned milk house. At 12:31 a.m., the mother arrived carrying the cub that later ended up with Mabel. She entered the milk house, where the other 2 cubs had already been moved. At 12:48, she came out carrying that same cub again. The young animal was visibly weaker than its siblings. When the mother set it down beneath the fence, it did not follow her. It lowered itself to the ground. She picked it up and continued toward Cedar Hollow. She separated it after she had already moved the litter, Aaron said. Malik nodded. That is what the sequence shows. Why? We can describe the conditions. We can't prove her reason. The conditions were difficult to ignore. The cub was the most heavily exposed. The mother's milk production had nearly stopped. The barn contained a nursing domestic queen, warm bedding, and the sounds and scent of kittens. Cameras proved the bobcat had investigated the barn more than once before she became critically ill. No one could say she understood foster nursing. But she had returned to a familiar place associated with a lactating mother when her weakest cub could no longer keep up with the others, and she could no longer feed it herself. Cal sat at the kitchen table after everyone left. Mabel's apple crate had been cleaned and returned to the tack room. One corner still carried shallow claw marks from her kittens. Aaron found him holding the trail camera print showing the bobcat at the barn door. You all right? No. She sat across from him. I kept thinking she left that cub because she was giving up. Aaron said nothing. She wasn't walking away from it. She hauled it farther, to the one place where there was another mother. Cal pressed his thumb against the photograph. What broke him was not the idea that a wild cat had trusted his farm. He could not know that. It was understanding that she had reached Cedar Hollow in a condition created at least partly by his decisions and still spent what strength she had moving the sickest cub toward a chance to survive. He had spent months treating Aaron's warnings as criticism because accepting help felt too much like surrendering control. Whatever instinct, scent, or learned familiarity had drawn the bobcat to Mabel, she had used another mother's presence when her own body was failing. Cal looked at Aaron. I made needing help into something shameful. She understood he was no longer talking only about wildlife. Yeah, she said softly. You did. The next morning, Nina allowed the Bobcat family to share one connected enclosure. Staff opened the shift door remotely and left the building. The mother entered first. The cubs rushed toward her. She smelled them, licked the head of one, then lay down along the rear wall. All three pressed against her belly. There was still little milk, so Nina continued supplemental feeding through methods designed to minimize human contact. But the family was together. That should have felt like the hardest part ending. Instead, Malik arrived at Cedar Hollow with a new map. Tests had identified anticoagulant exposure in rodents from 7 properties surrounding the limestone ridge. Even if every owner removed bait that day, poison rodents could remain in the local food web for weeks. Nina would not release the family into that risk. Moving them far outside the mother's home range carried its own dangers and could separate her from terrain she knew. The cubs were growing quickly. Rehabilitation could protect them for a while, but not forever. Cal studied the 7 red marks around the ridge. One belonged to the county grain elevator, the largest feed operation in the valley. Its manager had already refused Malik's request to stop using anticoagulant bait during harvest. Cal reached for his truck keys. Changing Cedar Hollow had required admitting he was wrong. Keeping the Bobcat family alive would require asking the rest of the valley to believe him. The manager of the county grain elevator did not refuse because he disliked bobcats. Ray Colson refused because 20,000 bushels of corn were scheduled to arrive in 4 days. If rodents contaminate one storage bay, I answer to inspectors, farmers, and the insurance company, he told Cal. You're asking me to stop the control method my contractor guarantees during our busiest month. I'm asking you to replace it. With what? Aaron opened the integrated pest control plan on the conference table. The alternatives were not dramatic. Seal openings around conveyor housings, remove spilled grain every evening, repair 2 damaged exterior doors, use enclosed mechanical traps inside buildings and increase inspections around loading bays. Keep exterior vegetation short so rodents had less cover. Ray read the cost estimate. Then he looked at Cal. Your farm used the same bait. More than the same, I asked them to increase it. Malik stood against the wall without interrupting. Cal continued. The bobcat that hunted my feed shed nearly died. So did her cubs. I'm not blaming your elevator for what happened at Cedar Hollow. Sounds like you're about to. No. I'm telling you, I made the same decision you're defending. Ray pushed the papers away. Easy to regret it after something goes wrong. Cal nodded. That's exactly when regret gets expensive. The first estimate for changing the elevator program was $8,600, mostly labor and repairs that had been postponed for years. Ray said the cooperative board would never approve an emergency expense on the strength of one poisoned bobcat family. Cal thought of the money he had set aside for a replacement hay mower. The old machine leaked hydraulic fluid, overheated on steep ground, and had already broken twice that summer. I'll guarantee half the conversion cost, he said. Aaron turned sharply. Dad! He looked at her before signing anything. It mattered that he did. The mower fund, he said. I know which fund. If I spend it, we repair the old one another year. And if it dies during second cutting, we lose part of the crop. Ray stared at him. You're willing to risk hay income over cats that may never come back to your place? Cal remembered the split-eared mother collapsing beside the blue bait station after carrying her weakest cub into Mabel's crate. I'm willing to pay part of the cost of a decision I helped normalize. Aaron was quiet for several seconds. Then she pulled the estimate closer. If we do this, it can't be you buying absolution by yourself. Cal almost answered automatically. Instead, he waited. Aaron tapped 3 items. The school agriculture program can help fabricate the interior trap boxes as a supervised shop project. No poison. The cooperative should cover repairs that protect its own grain. You cover only the temporary labor gap. Ray looked between them. 3,000? 3, Aaron said. Cal nodded. It was the first major farm decision in years that he and his daughter made together, rather than around each other. By evening, the cooperative board approved a 21-day suspension of anticoagulant bait around the elevator. The vote was not unanimous. Neither was the rest of the valley. At a meeting in the volunteer fire hall, poultry growers described rats chewing wiring and contaminating feed. One cattle producer said nobody would care about the bobcats after losing a barn to an electrical fire. Another farmer asked whether Cal planned to compensate everyone for every sack of grain a mouse touched. Cal stood beside a folding table with the photograph from his hay barn camera in his hand. He had not planned to show it. Then he did. The image showed the mother bobcat carrying the sickest cub toward Mabel's crate shortly before she collapsed. "I asked for more bait because sealing my buildings took time I didn't think I had," he said. "The boxes worked exactly as designed. The mice ate from them, left, and became prey." No one interrupted. "I'm not asking anybody to tolerate rats. I'm asking us to stop pretending poison stays where we put it." Walt Miller stood first. "My place is switching," the grain elevator followed. By the end of the meeting, 6 of the 7 properties Malik had mapped agreed to temporary bait removal and intensified exclusion work. The 7th agreed the next morning after Malik showed the owner laboratory results from rodents collected beside his own fence. For 10 days, Cedar Hollow became busier than it had been during harvest. Neighbors repaired feed doors. Students built enclosed trap boxes under Aaron's supervision. Aaron Pike returned without blue bait stations and helped identify entry points around storage buildings. Cal hauled scrap steel, swept grain, and repaired his old mower at night. At Nina's rehabilitation center, another kind of preparation was happening. The Bobcat family moved into a large outdoor conditioning enclosure screened from the human activity. The mother entered first, hugging the brush line instead of crossing open ground. All 3 cubs followed. The one Cal had first seen beside Mabel moved more slowly than its siblings, but no longer appeared weak. When Nina remotely opened access to a second section containing logs, rocks, and tall grass, the mother disappeared into cover within seconds. "She's doing exactly what I want," Nina told Cal by phone, "avoiding people." The family hunted live prey appropriate for rehabilitation under controlled conditions. No one fed them by hand. No one tried to recreate the strange morning in the barn. Mabel, meanwhile, returned to ordinary farm cat life. Her 3 kittens were nearly weaned. She slept on hay bales, hunted around the tack room, and complained whenever Cal closed her indoors during rodent inspections. The apple crate remained empty. On the 11th day, Malik arrived at Cedar Hollow carrying a cooler. Cal knew from his face that something had failed. A mouse collected beside the limestone ridge had tested positive for anticoagulant residue, not a high concentration, still positive. Another from near Miller's boundary showed the same compound. "We stopped using it," Walt said when he came over. Malik nodded. "That doesn't make exposed prey disappear immediately." Cal looked toward the ridge. "How long?" "No one can promise." Nina joined them by speakerphone. The cubs were approaching the point when continued rehabilitation brought its own concerns. They needed to develop normal independence without becoming accustomed to captivity. The state had approved an alternative. A remote wildlife management area, 76 miles south, had suitable bobcat habitat and no current anticoagulant use concern in the release zone. Cal understood before Nina finished. "You're moving them. If the next environmental samples are still positive, yes. The mother knows this ridge. I know. She chose den sites here. She knows the creek, the limestone breaks, where the roads are. I know that too. Translocation was not ideal. Neither was releasing her into contaminated prey. There was no clean choice left." Cal walked to the hay barn after the call ended. Mabel was asleep inside the old apple crate with one nearly grown kitten sprawled across her paws. He touched the empty corner where the spotted cub had once lain. Changing the farm had cost money. Changing the valley had cost pride. Neither sacrifice could erase poison already moving through the land. The next morning, Nina scheduled the Bobcat family's transfer for Friday. Unless the final samples came back clean, the split-eared mother and all 3 cubs would leave Cedar Hollow for a place none of them had ever known. Friday arrived with 2 positive laboratory reports. The first mouse had been collected near Miller's fence. The second came from the limestone drainage below Cedar Hollow. Both carried measurable anticoagulant residue. Neither concentration was high. Neither was zero. At 6:30 a.m., Nina began preparing the Bobcat family for transfer. Cal did not go to the rehabilitation center. Visitors near the conditioning enclosure would only add stress, and Nina had never allowed him close enough for the animals to associate him with food or safety. He watched through a secure camera feed from his kitchen instead. The split-eared mother entered a covered transfer crate after staff opened the shift door and withdrew. One cub followed her. The other two went into a second crate connected to the enclosure by a dark passage. The cub that had once slept beside Mabel was the last to enter. When the divider closed, Cal shut the laptop. Erin stood across the table. "They're not dying," she said. "I know. They're being moved somewhere safer." "I know that too." "But," Cal looked toward the hay barn, "but we changed everything after she got poisoned, and it still wasn't fast enough." Erin did not try to correct him. The state release team planned to hold the family for one night at a remote wildlife facility near the management area. The next morning, if veterinary checks remained normal, they would transport the crates to a secluded release site with rocky cover, water, and enough distance from roads and livestock. No crowd, no photographs with people standing beside the doors, no attempt to watch where the cats went after release. The plan was professionally sound. That made it harder for Cal to argue with. He spent the morning helping Erin inspect the last 7 properties in the voluntary rodent control agreement. At each farm, blue bait stations had been replaced by exclusion work, sanitation, and protected mechanical traps. The grain elevator had repaired both damaged doors. Miller had moved poultry feed into sealed metal bins. Cedar Hollow's feed shed was cleaner than it had been in 15 years. Still, the test results said poison remained somewhere in the system. At noon, Cal drove to the Cedar Ridge alone. He stopped before the den site and stayed outside the buffer Malik had marked weeks earlier. Leaves had begun filling the shallow trail where the mother once carried prey uphill. Nothing about the ridge looked different enough to explain why it was no longer safe for her. That was what hurt most. The danger had been nearly invisible when Cal introduced it, and it remained nearly invisible after he tried to remove it. He sat on a limestone ledge below the den. For years, every difficult farm decision had been reduced to what he could see immediately. Rats in grain bags, money leaving the checking account, a broken mower, a daughter giving advice from a life he had interpreted as separate from his own. The poison had forced him to understand consequences that traveled farther than the original problem. So had Erin. His phone rang at 12:46. It was Nina. The transport arrived at the holding facility. Cal stood. "Everybody okay?" "The mother is alert. Cubs are stable. They're staying covered and quiet. Tomorrow morning?" "That's still the plan." Cal looked at the empty trail. "Thank you for calling." He ended the conversation before his voice changed. At Cedar Hollow, Mabel's kittens had discovered the upper hayloft. 2 chased each other between bales while the third slept in the apple crate. Mabel sat on the threshold washing a front paw. Cal lowered himself onto an overturned bucket. The farm cat looked at him once and continued washing. He remembered the wild cub pressed among her kittens, spotted fur between orange bodies. At the time, the image had seemed impossible. Now the barn looked too ordinary without it. Erin found him there near 3. "You need to see something." She carried a map and a plastic evidence bag. Inside the bag was a weathered block of blue-green material. Cal stood immediately. "Where?" "Old Jensen place." The Jensen farm had been abandoned for 8 years. Its barn sat beyond Miller's north fence, inside the hunting range the Bobcat regularly used. No one had included the property in the bait removal agreement, because no active farming occurred there. Erin had gone there only because one of the positive mice had been collected within 200 yards of the boundary. Inside a collapsed grain shed, he found a rusted 5-gallon bait hopper. Its lid had broken. Dozens of old poison blocks lay beneath rotted boards where rodents could reach them directly. Malik arrived 10 minutes later. "How old?" Cal asked. "Packaging suggests several years, maybe longer." "Then why are they still dangerous?" "Some anticoagulant compounds can remain present in stored bait for a long time, if it stays dry enough. We need the lab to determine whether it matches what we're finding." The abandoned shed sat beside a limestone drainage that ran directly toward the ridge. Cal opened the property map. 3 of the recent positive rodent locations lined up along that drainage. For the first time, the remaining contamination had a possible center. The Conservation Department obtained permission from the Jensen estate representative before anyone entered the unstable building. A hazardous material contractor removed the exposed bait and contaminated debris, while Malik collected rodent samples from inside and around the shed. Cal wanted immediate answers. The laboratory needed time. At 7:10 that evening, Nina called again. The Bobcat family had eaten. The mother had spent most of the afternoon inside the covered section of the holding enclosure and avoided staff movement. "She's ready to be wild," Nina said. Cal could not decide whether the sentence comforted him. Release still at dawn? Unless something changes. After dark, he and Aaron sat on the back porch without turning on the yard light. "You could ask Nina to wait," Aaron said. "On what evidence?" "That you found the hopper." "We found a possible source, not proof." Aaron looked at him. A year earlier, Cal would have heard hesitation as weakness. Now he said, "If I ask professionals to risk those cats because I want them back here, I haven't learned anything." Aaron leaned against the porch rail. "No," she said, "you haven't." At 10:32, Malik's truck came up the driveway. He carried no cooler this time, only his phone. The lab rushed the bait comparison. Cal stood. "The material from the Jensen hopper matches the compound profile in the recent positive mice." Aaron stepped closer. "So that's the source?" "We can't say it's the only source." Cal almost laughed at the familiar caution. Malik continued, "But there's more." Before removing the hopper, the team had live-trapped 12 rodents around Cedar Hollow, Miller's farm, and the ridge using non-lethal sampling boxes. All were released after tiny blood samples were collected. The first 6 results had just returned. Everyone was negative. Malik showed him the message: 6 living animals, 6 clean tests. The old poisoned carcasses were still telling the story of what had happened. For the first time, the animals currently moving across the ridge were beginning to tell a different one. Malik's 6 clean rodent samples were not enough to cancel a wildlife transfer. They were enough to delay it. At 10:51 p.m., Nina called the state veterinarian and requested a 24-hour hold. The Bobcat family would remain at the remote facility while the remaining live trap samples were processed and the Jensen property was cleared. Cal listened from his kitchen. When Nina ended the call, she said, "This does not mean they're coming back." "I know. It means we have new evidence worth evaluating. This time I understand." Before sunrise, Malik and Aaron met the hazardous material crew at the abandoned Jensen shed. The rusted hopper came out first, followed by contaminated boards, loose bait fragments, and feed sacks rodents had nested inside. The structure was too unstable to save, so the estate authorized its removal after the poison was documented. Cal repaired his old mower until Malik called at 2:14 p.m. The second 6 live rodents are negative. Cal sat down on the tractor tire. "All 12? "All 12. "What about Jensen?" 2 rodents trapped inside the shed were positive. 1 along the drainage was positive. The farther samples were negative. The pattern finally made sense. The poison still existed, but its active center had narrowed to the abandoned grain shed. Recently moving rodents around Cedar Hollow and Miller's farm showed no detectable exposure in the rapid screening panel. Nina wanted one more layer of caution. State wildlife staff collected fresh prey samples along the limestone ridge and reviewed every anticoagulant source within the mother bobcat's likely range. The grain elevator remained on the temporary non-anticoagulant program. Miller's farm did too. Cedar Hollow had already converted. By evening, the state approved a change in release plan. The family would not be taken to the southern management area. They would go home. Cal gripped the phone but said nothing for several seconds. Nina broke the silence. "You understand you won't be at the release point?" "Yes." "No barn setup, no Mabel, no attempt to recreate what happened." "Yes." "We released near the ridge after dark. Covered crates, minimal personnel, cameras only after we leave." Cal looked toward the hay barn. "Bring them back wild." "That's the plan." The transport van returned to Cedar Hollow the following evening. Cal, Aaron, Walt, Aaron, and Malik waited at the farmhouse, nearly half a mile from the release site. Nina and the 2 state wildlife staff drove the crates up a service road toward the Cedar Ridge. No one followed. The release happened at 8:37 p.m. The mother's crate opened first, facing a limestone break beneath dense cedar cover. She remained inside for almost 3 minutes after the door lifted. Then her split left ear appeared. She stepped out low, smelled the ground, and moved immediately uphill. The first cub followed. The second ran the opposite direction for several yards, stopped, then turned after the mother's trail. The cub that had once been left with Mabel stayed inside longest. Nina waited behind the vehicle. Eventually, the spotted youngster came out, crossed the open strip in quick bounds, and disappeared into the cedars. No animal looked back. By 9, the team had removed the crates and left. At the farmhouse, Cal did not ask where the cameras were positioned. "They're gone?" he asked when Nina returned. "They're where they chose to go." That answer was better. 3 nights passed with no confirmed sighting. The cameras around Cedar Hollow remained active, but Cal stopped checking them every hour. He swept the feed shed, repaired fencing, and helped Aaron's students finish metal trap boxes for the grain cooperative. On the 4th morning, Mabel began staring through the lower hay barn door. Cal noticed while carrying a salt block. The calico cat sat beside the apple crate, ears aimed toward the goat lane. Her kittens, nearly weaned, wrestled behind her. Cal did not step outside. He lowered the salt block and waited. A spotted juvenile crossed the opening. It moved quickly, larger now than the cub he remembered. But one detail was familiar. The young bobcat favored its left side for 2 steps before leveling out. The cub that had been sickest. Mabel stood. She did not approach. The juvenile stopped 20 feet from the barn, smelled the ground, and looked toward the doorway. Then, the mother bobcat emerged from behind the blue feed shed. Her body condition had improved. The split in her ear was clear even in the dim morning light. One of the other cubs followed her along the fence. The third remained out of sight. The mother reached the juvenile and smelled its shoulder. Cal stayed behind the tack room door, almost exactly where he had stood the morning the story began. Mabel gave one warning hiss. The juvenile backed away. There was no reunion between foster mother and wild cub. No recognition Cal could prove. The farm cat guarded her own kittens. The bobcat mother gathered hers. That was enough. The female crossed the yard without approaching the barn. At the goat lane, she paused near the place where the last blue bait station had once sat. She smelled the dirt. Then she continued toward the ridge. The weakest cub followed her. Cal watched until the spotted tail disappeared through the grass. Aaron came quietly through the kitchen and stood behind him. "You okay?" He nodded, then changed his mind. "Not exactly." She waited. "I spent weeks thinking the thing that broke my heart was her leaving that cub." Cal looked at the empty barn doorway. It was realizing she was trying not to. Aaron rested one hand against the door frame. Outside, Mabel returned to the apple crate and began washing one of her kittens. A camera alert sounded on Cal's phone. When he opened it, the image showed all 4 bobcats together on the limestone ridge. The mother stood above the cedar root den, while 3 cubs moved through the rocks below her. Behind them, in the far corner of the frame, workers were removing the final contaminated boards from the Jensen property. The family was home, but Cedar Hollow still had one decision left to make: whether the changes everyone had promised for one crisis would survive after the bobcats stopped appearing on camera. The first winter after the poisoning was the first time Cal could remember celebrating a mouse that stayed out of his grain. Cedar Hollow still had rodents. So did Miller's poultry farm and the county elevator. The difference was that everyone finally treated the problem as something to manage continuously, instead of something a blue plastic box could solve by itself. Aaron's agriculture students finished 32 enclosed mechanical trap boxes before Thanksgiving. The cooperative bought the materials. Aaron Pike trained farmers to inspect entry points before recommending any chemical control. Malik arranged follow-up sampling around the limestone ridge, the abandoned Jensen property, and the drainage line where contaminated rodents had once moved toward the bobcat den. The first month produced no positive samples outside the remediated Jensen site. Neither did the second. By spring, the temporary agreement became permanent for 7 participating properties. Not everyone in the county joined. Cal no longer expected one meeting to change every farm. But the grain elevator kept its repaired doors, Miller kept feed in sealed bins, and Cedar Hollow never returned to anticoagulant bait. The old blue station from beside the feed shed stayed empty. Cal washed the dirt from it, removed the service label, and placed it on a high shelf in the farm office beside Aaron's original rodent control plan. He did not keep it as punishment. He kept it because the box had taught him how easily a boundary could be imagined where none truly existed. Aaron noticed it one afternoon while grading student projects at his kitchen table. "You saving that thing?" "Apparently." "For what?" "So I don't get clever again." She laughed, and Cal did too. Their relationship did not transform into perfect agreement. Aaron still corrected him when he postponed repairs. Cal still thought some of her school schedules were designed by people who had never met Hayweather. But he began calling before major farm purchases, and she started bringing her students to Cedar Hollow for supervised projects without waiting for him to ask. By the next summer, Cal hired a part-time farmhand. He had resisted that expense for years because needing another person felt like admitting he could no longer manage the place. Now he called it what it was: help. Mabel's 3 kittens were all placed in homes through the local veterinary clinic once they were old enough.
Cal had argued that one should remain in the barn until Aaron reminded him that Mabel was already an efficient mouse patrol by herself. Mabel stayed. She slept in the apple crate through cold weather, hunted around the tack room, and maintained the absolute certainty that every tractor seat belonged to her. The wild cub never returned to the crate. That mattered.
Nina's cameras showed the Bobcat family gradually spreading across the ridge as the young cats matured. By late winter, the three juveniles were traveling farther apart. In spring, cameras usually recorded the split-eared female alone. The cub that had been left with Mabel appeared twice near Cedar Hollow after release. Both times it remained outside the farm buildings. One recording showed the juvenile crossing the goat lane just before dawn. It smelled a fence post, passed the hay barn without stopping, and disappeared into blackberry cover. Cal watched the clip once. Then he deleted the alert from his phone and left the animal alone. Nina called that progress. "Yours or the Bobcats?" Aaron asked. "Mine, unfortunately." The mother remained in the limestone country. Her split ear appeared on cameras near the ridge for almost 3 more years.
She avoided the farmhouse, traveled mostly at night, and sometimes vanished from every camera for weeks. No one knew where she denned after the cedar root site or whether she raised another litter. There was no reason they should. Malik removed the camera nearest the old den after the monitoring project ended. "We have what we need," he told Cal. "No point turning her life into a show." Cal understood. The strangest part of the story was never that a bobcat had become tame enough to use a barn. She had not. It was that a wild mother, weakened and unable to feed her most affected cub, had repeatedly approached a place she normally avoided. Cameras showed she already knew a nursing farm cat was there. The sick cub could not keep pace with its siblings. The mother carried it away from the secondary den and into the one warm space where another lactating cat happened to be raising young.
No one could prove she understood foster nursing. No one needed to. The sequence of her actions was enough. The cub survived the hours that mattered because Mabel accepted it, because Cal did not interfere too quickly, and because professionals took over before a temporary arrangement became a dangerous one. The mother survived because Nina recognized the poisoning. The litter survived because Malik found the other cubs. And the ridge became safer because the people who had caused part of the risk were willing to change what they did next. Years later, Cedar Hollow's hay barn still carried claw marks on the corner of the apple crate. Cal never sanded them away. One September morning, almost exactly 4 years after he first saw the split-eared female in the doorway, he entered the barn before sunrise and found Mabel sleeping there alone. Outside, dew covered the goat lane.
Fresh bobcat tracks crossed the soft ground beyond the feed shed. They did not enter the barn. Cal followed them only with his eyes as they turned toward the limestone ridge. If this story stayed with you, share the moment that affected you most or a time an animal changed the way you understood responsibility. And if you enjoy thoughtful wildlife stories where compassion means knowing when to help and when to step back, you're welcome to join us again. Mabel stretched inside the old apple crate as morning light reached the barn floor. Beyond the fence, the tracks disappeared into the hills, exactly where a wildcat story was supposed to continue.